Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of Let's Talk Astrology. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by highly esteemed astrologer, author, and lecturer Lee Lehman, and also our highly esteemed faculty member, Mary Gotterud. So, in today's episode, we're talking about relationship horary and also horary in of itself. So, my first question is, before we get to the chart examples, is how important is the history of Horary in the lineage of astrology through the centuries?
I would say that importance of horary is much higher than most modern astrologers would necessarily assume. And there are good historical reasons for this, primarily being that many people did not have good birth times. They may have had approximate birth times, but in different cultures, first of all, just the availability of timepieces is a huge issue in astrology. Did the average person have access to an accurate way of even recording the birth of their child? In a society where people had to rectify charts in order to use nativities, being able to ask a horary question about what's going on at the moment was something that was seen as much more useful than it became in our later society, the last couple of centuries, where more people, percentage wise, had access to birth charts, and so tended to think of that as the form of astrology that everybody knew. Plus, you had a lot of people who were a little nervous about the idea of just how much destiny there is in a wedding.
Indeed. I would say modern astrology has shied away from being predictive based or making predictions being the focus. And that's what horary is all about. And when you start to study it, it really begs the question about the nature of reality, I think, and free will versus determinism. I think a lot of modern astrologers shy away from a more deterministic view of the universe and have crafted their astrology to reflect that. But these techniques have developed over 1,000 years, Lee. I mean, from Ptolemy
More than
through
that,
to,
yeah,
yeah.
more than 2000 at this
So,
point.
and into the Middle Ages, it was really refined by Masha Allah, Abu Mashar, Saul, and became really a legitimate, more than legitimate form of inquiry. I think really a bedrock of many of the other branches of astrology. Horary principles are sort of embedded foundationally in every other branch of astrology. Even reading a nativity, I think as modern present day astrologers to study horary really is, no matter what sort of astrology one practices, it's an essential tool to learn and will only enrich your ability to read a chart.
I think Richard also, in a very strange way, simplify because it's a question of being able to cut to the chase and really be able to see what are the most important indicators. A lot of beginning students of astrology, and I'm not speaking here of horror, but of all forms of astrology, I get stuck on, well, now, okay, I've learned the meanings of the planets, I've learned the meanings of the signs, I've learned the meanings of the houses. Now, what do I do with it? And it's in bringing those pieces together that some of this method, we call it horary, but in the old days they called it general astrology. And that general astrology was an underpinning of all forms of astrology. And so, in that sense, all astrology had a similarity to it because it's all based on the same principles. We're all using the same planets. We can have arguments about tropical and sidereal, but we can have arguments about house systems just because we like to argue. But I mean, the basics are the same.
Great point.
Indeed.
So now, as everyone can see on the screen, this is a hilarious quote. We've got wedding is destiny and hanging likewise. So now we're going to dive into some relationship horrors as examples, but I love this quote right here.
Yeah, It's a humdinger for sure. That's a great way to think about your relationship life. So, in relationship horaries, as with all horaries, the first thing you must do is determine what the primary significators are in the question and whether or not they have a relationship. So, what planets rule the matter propounded by the querent being the one asking the question. And the astrologer casts a chart for the moment that they understand the question. That's a very important point that will be covered in the course and what constitutes the appropriate moment to cast a chart. And with relationships, as we can see here, the first, fifth, seventh, and 11th houses come into focus. And those are the ones, depending on the context of the question or the matter being asked about, you would look at the significators or rulers of those houses and what their interaction or what their essential dignity, accidental dignity, relationship to each other. Is there a relationship at all? And what I found amazing about horary as I embarked upon my study with Lee was the level of nuance that you can derive and the amount of information that's encoded in a horary chart that is so descriptive of the moment. And I think that that can be a little bit intimidating as well once you dive down that rabbit hole, because it really does sort of bend your mind to think about the nature of reality and how everything is connected and everything can be encoded in a singular chart of the moment.
Sorry,
Yeah,
you talked there about houses, so let's hit on a hot topic in that which house system do you both primarily use and why?
I use Regiomontanus basically because I feel that my lineage is most strongly grounded in William Lilly. And so since that was his house system, it's good enough for me.
I use Regiomontanus because I have studied horary and medical astrology with people who are of that lineage, as Lee is, and I feel like the technique that you learn is best used with the the house system that the technique developed in, or like William Lilly used it and wrote an extensive manual in English that was, when was it recovered or rediscovered in the 80s and published again, Lee? Was that kind of came to
The
prominence?
Regulus publication, yeah, it's it has in its own way been in continuous use, and there's a there are a zillion stories we could tell about the transmission of Woolley's work in England and its influence on the British astrological organizations and on British astrologers. But yeah, the what what was so awesome, I think, for many astrologers who were unaware of even the existence of horary or thought it was just something that was on the fringes of astrology instead of it in the center as it had been for many, many years, is the comprehensiveness of the book. And it also has a rather strange name because Lilly's book was entitled Christian Astrology, which seems to be rather odd when you think about it, because we would not be thinking about the area of the United Kingdom as being anything but Christian, unless you want to go back to Roman times. So it's been a while, but anyway, so that's it. But it's a fine book. There were earlier books on horary, many earlier books. We mentioned Bonatti. We can mention the Arabic period, and Saul's a good example from there of authors that we can certainly study and get a lot out of. There was even in the medieval period a compilation of the nine judges, which took nine of the experts, so to speak, at the time, and broke out the work so that if you were looking at relationship horrors and you wanted to look up a marriage, it it compiled the seventh house aphorisms, the seventh house, as you see here, being the marriage house, together from the different authors by name so you could compare how they would have read the same thing. So there's just a wealth of information about how this was done historically, and multiple sources where you can see nuances between how people did it, but you can also see the unity of thought as well.
Points. Okay, so I think we have some examples coming up. So let's dive into what we've got.
Yeah, so here we see obviously the house breakdown of the significators. And our first chart, our relationship chart, do we have a chance? Everyone, as astrologers, knows that relationship questions are one of the most frequently asked questions. And I think that in a consultation session, maybe people don't realize that many questions that people come to the session with could probably best be answered or addressed with the casting of a horary chart. Relationship questions in mind. I mean, you can look at a natal chart to see somebody's natal predisposition, context, where they're coming from for having a relationship. But for specific questions, horary and is the primary method, I think, and the best method to answer these questions. And keep in mind that the question has to be sincere. That's a big part of horary. It can't be a flippant, casual question. It has to be one that's very earnest and sincere and asked after all other avenues have been exhausted. So this is a serious undertaking. It's not like, oh, let's just ask for the sake of asking. But in this chart, do we have a chance? We would look first at the first and seventh house. All relationship questions are primarily a first, seventh question, and even contractual relationships, correctly, like any
Yeah.
kind of and so that you really think about what relationships are in their essential nature. It might be a little mercenary to think of all relationships as a contractual one. In the cases of marriage, certainly there is a marriage contract. And this is the place where you would make a distinction. Is the relationship a more serious one, or is it a fifth house matter where it's more of a love affair? And then always the querent is signified by the first house. So you would pick out the ruler of the first house and start to examine their placement in the chart and their essential dignity. And in this case, it's the moon in Cancer, which is the sign of its rulership in the 12th house. Now, if we were to look at this in terms of a love affair, do we have a chance? It sounds perhaps like it's not like they're married already. We would consider the fifth house ruler, which is Scorpio. And here we get into back to your point, Callum, about what house system is used. Obviously, William Lilly and many of the classical astrologers used Regiomontanus. So the context in which the techniques really came to fruition are used in the class. And this house system affords house cusps, which are an important part of the technique. And that's one of the big rationales for using a quadrant-based system, because there's a lot of information encoded in the house cusps as well that a whole sign system doesn't necessarily give you. So now we're looking at the cusp of the fifth house. That's Mars, and Mars is in the seventh, not in fantastic shape there, conjoined to Saturn. Now, if we were to look at it in the context of a marriage, when we were looking at the seventh house, that significator is Saturn, very strong in the seventh house. So we would consider its essential dignity. But also, are the first and seventh house significators, do they have a relationship? Are they coming together? Are they separating? Also, if it was a fifth house question, the first and fifth significators, what's their relationship? What are they doing? Do they see each other? And the Ptolemaic aspects are used in traditional horary astrology. So from this chart, we would say right out of the gate, pretty simple, nobody's seeing each other. So that's a pretty straightforward answer. I think frequently people get a little bit freaked out by the fact that, horary astrology, like it's a pretty quick yes, no question.
When I was writing
The
martial art, one of the things that I did was I pull up all of the relationship charts where I had answers. And it turned out that I think about 2/3 of the time the answer was no. And I was actually kind of heartened by that. And, this doesn't sound like what you'd get heartened by, but do you have to, you know, talk through the initial round of shock? But the thing is, why would you get a no? Well, the people who are asking horaries, the whole thing is they're serious about the question. If you know something is absolutely right, why bother with a horary? So you've just eliminated a bunch of the yeses because the person isn't stopping to get permission, to get explanation. They're just in the moment. So, at the very least, what this chart is showing on the marriage side, first of all, the querent looks like they're in great shape as as people, as the moon in Cancer, a strong person, but in an unfortunate place in the 12th house. So, two pieces of information about your querent. If, I like what Mary did here with contrasting what this would be like, but between the fifth house and the seventh, between a casual relationship and a more serious relationship. The more serious relationship there was Saturn. Saturn's in Aquarius. Saturn's strong, Moon's strong. Both people are strong people. They're showing as, fully formed, not problematic, but they're just not interacting with each other. If you go to and say, had the question been about an affair sort of thing or a more casual thing, well, now you have instead of having Saturn, you have Mars pretty much in the same place. They're still not relating. But you have this sense that the fifth house person is thinking about marriage because now the ruler of the fifth is in the seventh. So you're getting information, whether the answer is yes, whether the answer is no.
And that's what has blown me away about horary, the level of granular detail that you can get from a chart by examining placement, dignity, uh, relationship to benefics and malefics, even to how the significator's describing how people's physical appearance, the condition of the moon and its separating and applying aspects, describing the recent past and the near future. It really is an incredibly powerful tool for divination. And I think that once many people start studying horary, they get bitten by the horary bug. I know I did, right? Like, wow, you can tell all that just from one chart.
So here we're talking about, obviously, these both significators are in strong shape, dignity-wise. We obviously see there's no connection here. Is there any case in Horary where another planet might come into play that might link the planets?
That's called a translation of light. Basically, with any chart, and this one has all sorts of things that you could look at and consider. Any way you can link planets can be giving you additional information, and planets can be other people as well as other concepts. Like here, we have this very strong moon that's just in a somewhat unfortunate place. But then you look at the other planets and say, huh, I wonder who that Mercury is up in the ninth house. Because here's Mercury in a what was called a partile or perfect or within 1 degree orb with that moon, another person perhaps. So, here on the one hand, this query is asking about, person A, but who's person B in the person of that Mercury? And why is that person B Mercury that person A is seemingly interested in on the side, so to speak, about to get about to hit Neptune, um, which, as often as it could be mystical, could also be delusional. So again, the story multiplies. And the story multiplies again when you think about the fact that you've got the moon here separating from the square with the sun, suggesting some sort of disagreement with somebody else, or at least being in the field of disagreement, being in the area where disagreement is occurring. So again, we multiply the number of scenarios that the chart is talking to us about.
And the idea that looking at the headlines, right, really trying to simplify and have an elegant delineation, and because there can be some wandering off into the wilderness. I think part of that martial art of horary astrology is to really get zen about it and notice, pick out the main points and the main headlines and focus on those and develop those. And that comes with practice. So looking at angular planets is very important to the practice. And that sun right there on the midheaven in Aries, what story does that, what piece of the story does that tell? That's very important. And while in the traditional technique, outer planets weren't used because they weren't discovered yet, of course. But if you were to use modern planets, which I know Lee does, especially use and notice, especially if they're angular, as they are here, like that's a huge headline you can't ignore. So that Mars, Saturn, Pluto, Jupiter in the seventh house is really going to be very descriptive, perhaps, of the seventh house person in relationship to this querent. So that's a lot of information that you can gather and reflect back to the client and be useful to them to be like, what exactly is the quality of this person? Who exactly are they? Do you know who they are? That moon applying to Neptune might, as Lee said, idealize and overlook the reality of what that seventh house contains.
So as Lee was saying, most of the answers to these questions are no, and it seems like this might be the case here. As we move to the next one.
Now, one of the things that you
So
do
here we
when you work with horaries is you let the querent, you let the person asking the question ask the question, and ask the question the way they want to ask the question. As it is, as it is, both of these people had asked the question exactly the same way as far as the words they use. Do we have a chance?
which kind of implies that there's something drastic that's happened, right? You can already get some information from the way the question is worded. Chance doesn't sound very good. So do we still have a chance? And we would look at the querent immediately, the first house significator, in all questions, whether or not they're relationship questions. You always want to determine the first house ruler and its condition. And here we have Virgo. So the first house ruler is Mercury in Aries. It's on the cusp of the seventh and eighth houses, and there is a rule, a 5-degree rule, that states that if a significator or planet is close within 5 degrees of a cusp, it gets drawn back into the prior house. So we have an eighth house Mercury in Aries. And we have here Pisces on the 7th, and that ruler would be Jupiter in Sagittarius, which is very strong if this was a marriage question or more committed relationship question. However, well, Mercury is applying to Jupiter, so there is that going for them. But if we looked at this in a more fifth house, first, fifth house context, then we have Saturn, and that is also very strong in Capricorn. Mercury is moving towards a square to Saturn. So there is some promise, although applying aspects by square might not be the easiest connection. And that is all developed in the class, like the nuance of the qualities of the connection and how easily or with more difficulty the matters might come to pass or come together.
So, what significance do retrograde planets have in Horary astrology?
It does also, it messes up the timing, among other things. And I'm saying that kind of generically because it does a couple of things. Here, for example, it's Jupiter that we'd look at as the seventh house ruler if we're looking at this as a seventh house question. One thing that happens as a result of the retrograde, if you think about it, is both Mercury and Jupiter are applying to each other. So you can have a sudden resolution with a retrograde planet that doesn't occur within the time frame you would have expected because they're both actually moving together. You can have delays as a result of the retrograde. If it were in the other direction, if it were Jupiter that was direct and Mercury that was retrograde, then they would actually be mutually moving apart. So a huge piece of the delineation of the concept of retrograde comes from just looking at what this tells you about the directionality of the planets relative to each other.
And as you asked before regarding translation of light, there are all sorts of other intermediary planets, permutations, combinations of relationships, perhaps with an intermediary planet that can frequently intervene or block, obstruct, that you start to drill down on the astronomical movement of the planets in relationship to each other and what that has to say about the storyline unfolding. Now, once again, angular planets are really of paramount importance to consider. And we have Mars up here on the MC and Gemini. And since that is a very public statement about the context of the question, I would ask if perhaps there was an argument that had ensued, some bitter words exchanged that may have preceded or impelled the asking of this question. As an astrologer, you can gain some information from looking at the chart about what the immediate past was that impelled the querent to seek out your counseling services.
Or is that reinforced not only as a querent, our Mercury in Aries, we have the mutual reception with the Mars you've just mentioned. And if I'm looking at this correctly, it looks like that Mercury is going to meet up with the Mars first. Is that not going to be the first connection as it's moving? Does that make a significant, how does that imply what's been going on?
Well, one of the things that can happen here is Mercury would come to the sextile of Mars, which in and of itself is not too bad. It's more, in this case, it's how much has Mars followed the situation of already being on the midheaven, because that Mary's reference to an argument is also probably a very public argument, which is a little harder to walk back from. So there's on the one hand, you can look at that and see, okay, we might be able to resolve some of this. But then afterwards, Mercury keeps moving. One of the reasons we use the moon so much in horary judgment is because the moon, because it moves so much faster than everything else, tends to make more aspects than everything else. So you're always looking for what's it doing now, and what's it going to do next. Um, in this chart, what it's doing now with being in the same degree as Pluto is a pretty dramatic uh, answer. But then, it moves on. And so it's that issue of connecting things together and then moving them apart and then connecting things together. Um, the general understanding of how connections work by aspect in the classical sense is that if a planet is within orb of another planet, and that this is taking place within the same sign, that there is an effect that can occur. So here when we're looking at Mercury coming together with Jupiter, for example, um, you look at the 11 degrees of Mercury, the 23 degrees of Sagittarius, and that's they're 12 degrees apart. That's a big stretch for poor little Mercury to make, um, to be completely connected in with Jupiter. And so it's those kind of judgments that we'll talk about and explain how you can work with. But even when you have an approaching aspect, uh, it doesn't mean that it's not necessarily glue enough to be glue.
So next, we're going to look at a non-relationship horary, and Lee, you have another example for us to show.
Yes. What I'm showing you here is something that in a sense is a lot more simple. We have, I suppose you can say we might have simpler relationships with our computers than with partners, but maybe not. So, but at least there's a simple question here in, will I get a Mac in 6 months? A Mac computer. So one of the things that you also learn when you study horary is how to ask questions in a way where you'll get a clear response. Because this isn't, do I want Mac within 6 months? Um, this is, will I get it within 6 months, and not will I get a Mac at some uncertain time. So you can see here that the question had been posed um, specifically to say within 6 months. So now we have a querent who is shown by Mars. Now, one thing about looking at horary questions, you can't always assume that the planet that comes to represent you is the planet that is perhaps the strongest one, for example, in your own chart. But what this is saying about this particular querent is she's eager in the sense that she's Mars. She's certainly willing to buy it, which is Mars, because Mars is, not going to be reluctant about making a decision. But it's Mars in the eighth house, so is that necessarily the best place? Well, what might that represent? Well, that might represent the question that she's not sure she wants to spend the money on it, because she might have to put it on her card and not pay off the card and have some credit card debt for a while. So this is therefore starting to show some of the background behind why this is a question at all. Just plunk down the card. Well, maybe not. Um, Maybe so here are the kind of situations that are being suggested. We have a moon Neptune going on. Maybe the Mac isn't the best choice for her computer needs right at that moment. Um, it's taking place in the third house, And so, and what are third house things? Well, this is just, she would be using it in her kind of daily clerical uses. And again, this is not saying that this is necessarily the best investment. Um, the moon there is not happy in Capricorn. And so that's suggesting there may be some issues. There might be a bigger learning curve with it, for example, to learn the programs, or perhaps the programs that she would want to do on it aren't available, but she thinks they are. Um, that she would get work out of it is shown by the Mars, or excuse me, by the moon in Capricorn. It's at 9 Capricorn. And you can see that Mercury is at 17 Virgo. So she wouldn't just be playing games on it. But you get this kind of sense of unease from the position of her significator. So that's what I asked her. I said, I don't get the sense that the timing is right. And oftentimes, when you're telling people no, and I've already indicated historically with charts that with horrors that a lot of them are no, you don't necessarily want to say no, or no, you're a bad person because how dare you even ask this question? But one way that you can talk about it is to say the timing isn't right. Okay,
And I think
rethink
that's an
the
important point. It's an important point to put a window on questions and not have them open-ended, like, will I ever? You get a much more accurate answer that
Yes,
leaves open alternatives and options after that window is over.
and I think especially with relationships, because what so frequently happens when someone's in a relationship and then it dies, or for whatever reason it dies, and the person is in a post relationship state of depression, for lack of a better term. It's so easy for the person to say, will I ever get married again? Will I ever be in another relationship? And as the Horary astrologer, you really want to talk them out of that, because then what happens if they get no?
So emphasizing the point, in a way, you're kind of empowering the client that way. It's not a deterministic yes or no, but offering them a way to think about their situation. So when you say to them, this might not be the right time right now, it still leaves that open opportunity for way down the line. So they not leaving the session feeling like, oh my days, I'll never have a relationship again, I'll never get married. It's essentially sounds like you're empowering the client.
Well, I don't think of it necessarily with that wording, but I think that's the point, is that you don't want to, you don't want to say never if you don't have to. There are nevers. I mean, there are nevers in life, because people, by the time we all become adults, and we can understand this in an astrological context or a psychological context, or just even um, a world position context, when we remember that we do not have absolute freedom of movement and action, uh, because we're part of a bigger family, society, country, whatever. Um, so there are absolute no's, but it's your job isn't to rub your querent's nose in that. It's your job is to to help the querent to contextualize what they're going through now, and realize that if they can't do something right now, that doesn't mean they will never be able to do it.
And I think that is keys into the ongoing debate, perennial debate about free will versus determinism. Like, this is not a practice to shut down all possibility and human potential, right? It is to empower and to arm people with information so that they can make the best choices. And I think that the ultimate example that people have free will is they can choose to listen to a horary astrologer or not. They'll still go off and do whatever that they want to do. And the horary is designed to, like, everything is in flux, and horary is best used to describe the moment of now and the immediate past and the immediate future. And there is, because all things are in flux and there is free will, conditions will change outside of that window and the planets keep on moving.
Also, I think, Lee, you brought up an important point talking about environmental and cultural factors, because if you're talking about relationships, a conversation with somebody in a country with arranged marriages is going to be a very different conversation to someone who's free to choose partners, things of this nature. So bringing that cultural context is sounds very important.
Yeah, I think what it does, it's an interesting tool for every astrologer to know enough about. Not, it's not something you may not feel comfortable doing this as a major part of your practice, but I guarantee you that if you know about it, you'll be doing it with yourself personally, because it helps to focus the mind when you're on a problem, away from the fact that it's a problem to what is the solution and what are my alternatives.
Both of your thoughts on Horary in terms of not individual questions, but in larger mundane events such as elections, what's going on with the country. Is that sufficient enough for an individual to ask when it affects so many people, even though it might be important to them? What are your general thoughts about the larger questions in life?
I think we'll probably have the same answer. The point of horary is that the question be narrow and focused and pertinent to the querent, and that the querent have a burning need to know, and that it is directly applicable to them. Asking a question that applies to a vast swath of the population doesn't have those qualities. So the chances that you're going to get an accurate answer are greatly diminished because it's not focused on your immediate reality. Asking questions on behalf of other people are really fraught too, and I know that has ethical implications, and I think can lead to static or noise. The receiver isn't going to deliver as clear a message as if it's a directly personal question.
In general, for things like political elections, they're mundane event. There's mundane astrology. And I think this is always something that we need to be aware of. What's the best tool for that which the querent is looking for?
So my last question
And
before
many,
we oh,
oh, sorry, many of the principles of mundane astrology are part of horary too. Horary is at the foundation of mundane medical and electional astrology. Electional astrology is, as Leah has said, reverse engineering a horary chart. So there are many principles that are the same that you apply to, like, reading a mundane chart. But as far as asking a question to get a predictive answer, it's not like the right, as Lee says, the right tool for the job. You're using a hammer where maybe a screwdriver is more appropriate.
thank you for answering that question. So my last question before we get to the specific details of the course and the class is, when can a question, in a sense, be thrown out? What do you see in a chart where it just cannot be read?
There's a general sense of when a question is too early or too late. And that is taken from if the ascendant is a couple of degrees, like up to maybe 2 or 3 degrees, it may not be readable because it may not be clear yet. Now, again, and I've used the word judgment several times. The reason I have used it is because the astrologer does have to judge this issue. Because they would also similarly say that if it's more than 27 degrees rising, that the question may be too late. So those are ones where you don't answer. I would say actually that the astrologer always has the choice not to answer a question. And I'll give you the example. I've only done this 1 or 2 times personally, but I had a client some years ago who was asking me about a lost dog. And I said she would not recover the dog, that the dog had been dog napped. And what she wanted to do was a follow-up horary about what had happened to the dog. The dog had been taken by a breeder, I believe, and was being mistreated. She wanted the blow by blow of how that was happening. I refused to answer the question, and I had nightmares for about 3 weeks. And I did not answer the question because I did not want to say what I saw. So I am firm in saying that I think what you need to do is have a way of telling people politely that you don't want to answer the question. But you always have to, as you have to maintain your own sanity too. And so you always have the choice not to answer.
Wow, that sounds like
And
an awful.
frequently, go ahead, Cal.
No, I was going to say that sounds like an awful, awful situation. Sorry, Mary, go ahead.
Oh, and questions, I mean, people confronted with the brutal realities of our human existence are impelled to ask horary questions. So I think that's part of training as a horary astrologer, being prepared to help contain some of these realities when people are searching for missing pets, lost children. It does behoove the astrologer to be prepared for and have a way to limit and self-care what they will around limits around what they will and won't answer, because often people are driven by some difficult experiences to seek answers to their questions that are unanswered.
Thank you both for answering those very illuminating answers. Okay, so now let's switch on to course specifics. Let's talk about the course details and what's coming up at KeplerCollege.
Yes, please join us. Horary Astrology, learn from the master. I feel so privileged and honored to be co-teaching this class with Lee. And it takes place in the winter term coming up for KeplerCollege. Begins January 10th, 2026 at 8 a.m. Pacific. It's a 2-hour class for 5 weeks. And we will be covering the fundamental concepts of horary astrology. It's an introductory course, and we will be covering several topics each week, including the components of horary astrology, the basic technique or rules, if you will. The first week, we'll do a bit of history and to the deep dive into the lineage and the development of it. And then in the subsequent weeks, we actually do very hands-on practicum style dissections of horary charts. So students get a real concrete practice and as a way to internalize these techniques. And I think that that's something really fantastic about this course. There are in-class practicum sessions and then weekly assignments where everyone is tasked with delineating a question themselves that's posed, and then we compare, reveal the answers, and everyone can see how they did. So, relationships, marriage, and conflict, buying and selling. We'll go over medical and health issues in the fourth week, and then money and jobs and sort of career questions in the fifth week.
This is at Kepler part one of two horary classes. To take you through the various different components. So there's more questions than the ones that Mary has listed that you can also do. So just by way of, if you can't get enough, you can get more.
Absolutely wonderful. I'm sure many people will be excited to join this class. So let me flesh out. I know the prerequisites say this course requires low intermediate astrological knowledge. Can you just flesh out, by students coming in, what kind of background and astrological knowledge do they need before they attempt this class?
Well, I
Planet
would
sign
say obvious
houses.
planet signs, houses, aspects, essential dignities. Ideally, having a firm grasp on that will definitely aid the student in being able to dive right in and start assessing a chart.
Although
And I
we will
know
go over some of that.
Fantastic. So to reiterate,
modern astrologers, don't be scared. Evolutionary astrologers, you're welcome. There's room for everyone. Come to the party. Come on in. The water's fine.
Wonderful, wonderful. So for everybody watching, to reiterate, both in the comment and description boxes, you'll find links to the classes. If you're watching this video in the very distant future, I will put a link to the current classes that we have on. So you'll be able to, whenever you watch this video, click on and see what available courses there are. So again, thank you so much, Lee and Mary, for a very enlightening conversation talking about horary astrology, and I'm sure many of you out there will be excited to join this class. So thank you both so much, and I hope to speak to you both again someday soon.
Thank you, Cal.
Thanks, Cal.
Wonderful. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.